All right. It's my great pleasure to introduce Rich Caruana today. Yeah, he did a PhD on multitask learning at Carnegie Mellon University. Afterwards, held a few positions in industry before actually coming back to universities where he had professorships at CMU, UCLA, and Cornell before finally joining Microsoft, where he still is today. I first learned about his work when doing my bachelor thesis, actually, where I used ensemble selection. And we later on continued actually using that in AutoML systems like AutoSQLearn, and I think kind of became a standard there. But besides that, he's also known for other works in AutoML, for example, model compression and actually running large-scale empirical studies. But I believe your research also shifted a bit into actually learning more about interpretable models and how to use them for healthcare applications. And today I'm really excited to learn about his thoughts on new frontiers and opportunities for AutoML. And with that, let's welcome Rich Caruana and give him a nice round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And thanks for inviting me to talk here. So I'm going to talk about some new opportunities in AutoML research. So let's just start with a brief history of machine learning, right? We had perceptrons in the 50s, and then K-nearest neighbor were popular with statisticians, then decision trees, then the second coming of neural nets as they grew hidden layers in the 80s. And then we started seeing more principled methods, perhaps like Bayes nets and SVMs in the 90s. And then boosted trees and random forests and bagging came on the scene in the late 90s. Although some people around 2000 still thought SVMs were going to be the answer. Then around, by 2010, we had deep neural nets. So we had neural nets, the third coming of neural nets, and they were really doing phenomenal things on images, in particular cats, and doing very well also on text and acoustic. But we saw a sort of switch where deep neural nets became the province of images and large data of that kind, and gradient boosted trees and random forests were still sort of king of the hill on tabular data. And yesterday Frank mentioned that tabular data is sort of the roots of AutoML. So we're going to talk about tabular data quite a bit today. And then, of course, neural nets have, I don't know, what you might call the forthcoming. That's large language models, foundation models, transformers, things like that. And they're unbelievably good at some problems like text. And then we'll talk a little bit more about tabular data in a second. One nice thing is all of these learning methods have different hyperparameters. So that's a great opportunity for AutoML through the years. And in the hands of researchers, right, the data science pipeline has always been very complicated. This is a slide from a presentation I gave at an AutoML workshop, I think 8 years ago, 2015 or 2016. And in the hands of researchers, right, it's a complex pipeline because they pride themselves on their ability to handle this complexity. And researchers are doing things like, recoding the features, feature selection, checking the calibration, recalibrating the model, dealing with missing values, tweaking the hyperparameters, tweaking the learning algorithm, discovering if there's leakage that they need to fix, all those sorts of things. And researchers really like doing that. But the beauty and the success of AutoML, and you should all give yourselves a round of applause. This is for everybody in the room and everybody before you. The beauty of AutoML is that the pipeline is now much more organized and orderly. And that's because AutoML has taken large parts of the complexity that we see here, and it has made that complexity become regular processes that we can do by real data scientists. You don't have to be like an expert in missing values to handle the missing values, perhaps. So real data scientists and engineers can do these things. Teams can do it. We can do it on real data. We can do it kind of on schedule and on budget. And more or less, it's a maintainable, repeatable, documentable process. So that's really been the success of AutoML. And I think this is what we're striving for is AutoML, to take this kind of mess and turn it into this kind of organized, reliable pipeline. Okay. Now, large language models, of course, have created some amazing opportunities here. Now there's the usual hyperparameter optimization. We think about that right off the bat. So this is things like NAS, architecture search, modifying the learning algorithm, learning rates, regularization parameters, all those sorts of things. But there's actually some new opportunities that maybe weren't so obvious before. So in particular, we now have something called prompt engineering, which I don't think any of us thought about 10 or more years ago, and fine tuning of these models. So that's a whole new category of opportunities for AutoML. And people are already working on that, right? So this is not a new idea, but obviously it's a new opportunity for us. There's another one, though, that might be less obvious, which is when people train these large language models, they have to decide what data to include in the training set. For example, there's a lot of work now in using very reliable data that comes from vetted sources, such as data from textbooks, data that comes from news agencies that are more trustworthy than the typical thing you might see on the web. And then there's a trade-off, like, well, do you use only trustworthy sources, or do you use the complex, messy data you see on the web? Do we use data that comes from multiple languages? Sometimes there are advantages to training these models with different languages all at the same time, different cultures. There are questions about whether adding examples of code and math to the training set improves the reasoning capabilities of the LLMs on other domains. So there's all sorts of really challenging and interesting questions about training these models, and AutoML can help with these things, right? It can help us decide what should be in the training set. Now, there's another thing that we're doing a lot of with these large language models, which are now like 1 trillion parameters and too expensive to use at runtime. So what we're doing is a lot of compression and distillation of these models. That is, we're training smaller, possibly special purpose models to mimic the large teacher model. Maybe we needed 1 trillion parameters to get an accurate model in the first place, but maybe we can now train a smaller custom tuned model to be really good at coding or really good at helping you rewrite sentences. Maybe we can train these specialist student models, and that creates a whole bunch of new opportunities for AutoML as well. Well, what architecture do we use for not only the teacher, but now for the student? What's the training regimen for the student? Do we use just synthetic data that's labeled by the teacher, or do we include some real data? What should that real data look like? How much synthetic data do we use? What domain should it be specialized for? How do we control, perhaps creativity, which you might think of as hallucination versus factualness? There are some domains where creativity is very important, and then there are other domains where factualness is very important. And then the beauty of AutoML is that for this sort of problem, it can often give you the Pareto optimal front of models. So that represent different trade-offs in, let's say, the size and cost of the models versus the accuracy of the models versus the domain that they're specialists in versus their creativity versus factualness. So these are all wonderful opportunities for AutoML. And I'm sure you're thinking about these things. As exciting as these are, people are already working on some of these, and I think these are somewhat obvious. So let's talk today about something that's a little less obvious, okay? So we're actually not going to talk about the things that I just mentioned. We're going to talk about something else. But I wanted you to realize that even in the world of large language models, this is a really rich domain for AutoML. And now there's another domain as well. So now I've gone back to this history of machine learning, and notice I had LLMs appear in the upper right, and that's for text, images, and things like that. But notice I left question marks here for what you might think of as the tabular data science. So what's hot these days, 2020s, on tabular data science? And there is a new kid on the block, been around maybe 10 years now. We keep improving it. And this new kid is glassbox machine learning. So this is learning methods that right out of the box are designed to be understandable, interpretable by humans. Okay, so that's what we're going to spend most of our time talking about today. You might be thinking, well, that's ridiculous. We're AutoML people. We optimize for accuracy. If you're interested in glassbox, you're going to have to use a restricted model class. You're going to leave accuracy on the table. That's not really what we want to do. So why would we really want to embrace glassbox learning in AutoML? Well, it turns out this trade-off that we thought existed, where black box models were the most accurate models, so that's things like deep neural nets, random forest, boosted trees, and ensembles of all those things. So these black box methods, which are not interpretable, but are very accurate, and then we always believe that if you did glass box learning, you really had to accept a loss in accuracy. It turns out that is no longer true for tabular data. It still is true for things like text and images, but it's no longer true for tabular data. And we have methods now, I'll talk about one of them today, explainable boosting machines, which are just as accurate on most tabular data sets as your favorite black box learning method. But it turns out they're even more interpretable, easier to understand than things like linear and logistic regression, which may come as a surprise to you. So let me tell you a little bit about these things, and I'll introduce them, and then we'll talk about the AutoML opportunities and needs that these things create. And there's going to be a surprise in there. Well, first of all, let me just give you some evidence that these things are good. So this is 10 classification problems. We're using AUC on test set to evaluate them. We've got EBMs in the first column, that's these glass box methods. And then we have some full complexity methods, black box methods like random forests and gradient boosted trees. And we've done the appropriate AutoML on all of these models on the right in order to optimize them. And then if you look at the average AUC across these problems, you'll see 0.866 for the glass box methods and 0.866, just by chance, for the best of the black box methods. So basically the glass box methods are in there competing neck and neck with the black box methods. Sometimes the black box method's a little better. Sometimes the glass box method's epsilon better. Sometimes they're tied. But basically they're up there competing in accuracy on almost all data sets. Now, you might take this with a grain of salt. You'll notice I'm a co-author on this paper, so maybe you shouldn't trust it. This is some work from Cynthia Rudin. She's a professor at Duke, well-known in the glass box learning community. And they observe in their work that the best interpretable models turn out to work about as well as the best black box models, which also in their work was, say, XGBoost. And it turns out the best interpretable model turned out to be EBM. So they were using our open source code, and we were competing neck and neck with black box methods like gradient boosted trees. And although we won't talk about it today, I just want to mention, in addition to these EBMs, which are boosted tree-based models, we also have these things called NAMs, neural additive models. And this is some work we did a few years ago with some people at Microsoft, some people at Google, and Jeff Hinton at Toronto. And these NAMs also are training these additive models that we're going to talk about. And basically, NAMs and EBMs are kind of neck and neck. They have very similar performance, which is wonderful. Sometimes there's advantages to the EBM, sometimes advantages to the NAMs, but by and large, they're very similar in performance. But I won't talk about neural nets unless you ask questions about that. So I just want you to know that there are multiple ways of training these sorts of models. It's not just this one algorithm. Let me tell you what the EBMs are, what generalized additive models are. The simplest additive model, is linear and logistic regression. Now, it's obviously interpretable because it's a very simple model, not very accurate on most complex data sets, and that's because it can't model nonlinearities. And something people don't realize is not only is it not very accurate, but it often gets the sign wrong on some of the coefficients. There's a widely held belief, which is not justified, which is that, well, maybe you can't trust the magnitude of the coefficient, but you can trust the signs of the coefficients. And it turns out that's not true either. So you really do have to be careful when applying linear methods to very complex data sets that need something more than linear methods. Now, at the other extreme, we got black box learning, random forest, deep neural nets, LLMs, those sorts of things. Not very interpretable. That's why we call them black box learning. But they can be very, very accurate. And that's because, of course, they can model nonlinearities. One thing that's interesting, if you use something like LIME or SHAP to open up and try to understand what's going on inside these models, you often find that in addition to the really good things that they've learned some spurious things that are not statistically warranted by the data. And that's because they can be overly complex. So they sometimes learn spurious effects. And that can be important, especially when intelligibility is going to be important. In the middle, we have what you might think of as the Goldilocks models. They're just the right size and complexity. These are generalized additive models of which EBMs, explainable boosting machines, are just one instance. These things are actually, to experts, more interpretable than linear methods. And you might think, well, how can that be? Well, here's the kind of response that you learn with these things, these very simple graphs. And it turns out an expert would rather see that like normal body temperature is low risk, and then high fever is high risk, and hypothermia is high risk. They would rather see that on a single graph as opposed to trying to fit that with a straight line, which you can't do, right, because it's a cup-shaped response, or you'd have to create multiple features, you know, such as a hypothermia feature and a separate fever feature. So they actually like the fact that we can show them the complexity of the response of their system to one of these variables all in a single graph. It's really nice for the experts. I'll show you multiple examples of these, so hopefully you'll agree. These things can be much more accurate than the linear methods, and that's because they can learn nonlinearities. And then importantly, because they're restricted in complexity, as you're going to see in the next slide, they tend to learn real effects that are in the data. Now, I'm not trying to say they're perfect. Of course, they're not. This is statistical machine learning. But typically, when they show what looks like a large or statistically significant effect, you can find that effect in the data. So, and that's a good property to have. And we're going to talk about that more. We didn't invent generalized additive models. They were invented by statisticians at Stanford in the late 80s. This is Trevor Hastie's thesis. Rob Tibshirani was his advisor. These were very popular in the early 90s. And then machine learning started happening, and it kind of was more accurate than these methods. So machine learning kind of got the limelight starting in the late 90s and then the 2000s. What we're going to do is we're going to use modern machine learning techniques to really get these generalized additive models firing on all cylinders. We're going to do everything we can to make them accurate using modern techniques that all of us are experts in. And the surprising thing, we did not expect this when we started the work. The surprising thing is if you do a good job, you almost always get accuracy now out of these interpretable models that's comparable to the black box models on tabular data. Really kind of a surprise to us. Let me show you mathematically what these things are. Hey, a linear model, right? We all get that. It's an intercept, slope times a feature, slope times a feature. Full complexity models, they're all different. Let's just say it's some arbitrarily complex function of all the features. In the middle, we have these generalized additive models. And the simplest generalized additive model is a function of feature 1 plus a function of feature 2 plus a function of feature 3. So we have functions for each of our features. And those functions can be multimodal, nonlinear, very complex in any possible way. But they're functions of only one feature at a time. And then the response that you get from each of those functions is combined with addition. That's very, very important. It's also a tremendous restriction on the complexity of what these things can learn. In fact, functions of individual features being summed is not sufficient for many problems. So we can make these more complex if we want. So we can have a sum of functions of individual features. We can have a sum of functions of pairs of features. And now the model can do pairwise interactions. We can do three-way interactions, four-way interactions. If we go far enough, then we're at full complexity models. And what we're going to do is we will try to restrict ourselves to main effects, functions of individual features, and then a small number of the most important pairwise interactions. And we're going to do that for two reasons. The number one reason is that remains intelligible. I'll show you a bunch of these, so you don't have to take my word for it. And then importantly, if you do this really well, on the vast majority of data sets, we actually start matching black box learning, which is really kind of exciting. Okay. Apologies to people who may have seen this pneumonia example before, but I'm going to use this to just introduce the model class. I want to make sure you understand these things really well before we start talking about the implications for AutoML. This is an old data set. It has 46 features. This model class is a function of a feature plus a function of a feature. Guess what? We're going to have 46 functions. We're going to throw in 10 pairwise interactions, so we'll actually have 56 functions total plus an intercept. So we'll have 57 terms. At a high level, this is what it looks like. So we have a function. This is pneumonia risk. This is, you all have pneumonia. Sorry to tell you that. But we're trying to predict the chance that you might live or die from your pneumonia. So that's this prediction problem. And this is risk as a function of your age. This is risk as a function of your glucose level. Down here, we've got risk as a function of your respiration rate, risk as a function of your blood urea nitrogen. Now, we've got 56 of these graphs. You're only seeing a subset of them here, and they're all learned in concert. They might look like marginalization, where you just plot, chance of dying as a function of age while ignoring everything else. That's not what these are. Millions of boosted trees are used to train these graphs all together in parallel, and then they all work together. And then once we have the graphs, we throw away the trees. And the way you use the model is you find the patient's age, so you can find your age, you read it on the x-axis, you look on the y-axis, and that gives you a contribution to risk. And that contribution could be negative, 0, positive. The higher it is, the more your risk is increased, the more your mortality risk is increased. And every one of these functions gives us a score. And what we do is these are logits. So we're doing a classification here, essentially logistic regression. We add up all those scores, and the more positive that score, the higher your risk. The more negative the score, the lower your risk. And it's just the standard logistic regression function. So it's 1/1 plus e to the minus score. And in fact, if this had been linear logistic regression, we would have 1/1 plus e to the minus linear model in the exponent here. And all of these graphs would have to look like straight lines because that's the logistic regression is a linear model. But instead, we have these graphs, these nonlinear functions. So you can think of it as being the scores are coming from these graphs that are sitting in the model, which is up in the exponent here. But otherwise, this is just a more complex cousin to logistic regression. And then one thing I want to emphasize here is, at least in the logistic regression case, these scores are logits. So they're on a log scale. So you can't sum probabilities because then you get probabilities greater than 1, but you can sum logits. And so small differences here can make a big difference. So a total score of 0 is 50-50 when you include the intercept. If you go to a score of +1, then you've got like a 75% chance of mortality. +2 is an 88% chance. -1 is a 25% chance. So small differences, especially coming from just 1 or 2 features, can be very, very important here. So a difference of 0.2 or 0.3 can be quite important. Okay, let's jump to a model that's trained to predict pneumonia risk. Now remember, this is going to have 56 graphs in it and 1 intercept term, and I can only show you a few of these graphs. This is what the model has learned about your chance of dying from pneumonia as a function of your age. Okay, and the bottom is just a histogram of the patient density, most patients between 60 and 90, some younger, some older. The top is the risk model that has been learned by the EBM. And up is higher risk, down is lower risk. So let's interpret this graph. And remember, there's still 55 other graphs that we would want to look at. Well, it's good to be young, no surprise there. And the model is kind of telling us that young is sort of everybody under 50 is sort of equally young from a risk point of view for pneumonia. It could distinguish between people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, but it doesn't seem to want to do that. So this is very flat risk. And then risk only goes up a little bit as you go through 50s into your 60s. Then a surprising, rapid rise in risk at around 66, 67, 68. This is data from the US. That's retirement. In the US, when you retire, your healthcare provider changes. There's a good chance you might have moved. Your urgency to get to care, because you're not going to work every day, might have changed. So anyway, you might have thought retirement was always good for you from a health point of view. That's not necessarily the case, especially not in the US. But we see this rise in risk as people are retiring from pneumonia. By the way, this would not be true of all medical conditions, but it's true of pneumonia. And then we see a pretty rapid continuous rise in risk as patients become elderly, as they go through their 70s and into their 80s. I think there's nothing surprising about that. But there is a surprising step function jump in risk right at 85 at a round number, surprising flatness in risk in the upper 80s and 90s, and then an even more surprising drop in risk that's happening at about 100, 101. This rise in risk at 85, there aren't many phase changes in biology. I doubt your body knows you went around the sun 85 times and suddenly said, oh, bye. So I don't think that's what's happening. What I think is happening is in this data set, life expectancy is about 80 years. So patients 85 and older are definitely on the elderly side of being older. They have a number of illnesses associated with being old, and that's probably how they got pneumonia. And we think what's happening is that clinicians and the patient and perhaps the patient's family are deciding to less aggressively treat the pneumonia that the patient has when the patient is over 85. And we think this is an unconscious decision. There's nothing in healthcare policy in the US that suggests that you should do this. We think it's just a sort of, grandpa's 86, grandpa has all these illnesses associated with being this old. Because of that, grandpa now has pneumonia. The first 2 rounds of antibiotics didn't help. Maybe we're not doing grandpa any favors here. His time is approaching quickly. And we think the patient receives somewhat less aggressive treatment for their pneumonia at this round number. And we think that explains why risk goes up measurably right at above 85. Now, we think it's the same explanation for the drop-in risk at 100. I mean, think about it. The patients made it to being a centenarian. They're 100. That's an amazing thing. Maybe their 101st, 102nd birthday is 2 months away. It's just pneumonia after all. It's not a terminal illness if we treat it aggressively enough. The doctor wants to go for the record. The doctor wants to get you to that 101st, 102nd birthday. Maybe you as a patient want them to do that, and maybe your grandkids want them to do that. So basically, the doctors really go for it. They do not give up on patients typically who have made it to 100 if they have a treatable condition. If they have a terminal condition, that's different. You're not doing the patient any favors by fighting too aggressively. But if it's a treatable illness like pneumonia, the doctors really go for it. And when I give this kind of presentation to a medical community, inevitably doctors come up to me afterwards and they say, it's true. And I had a patient just like that a few months ago, and they had this condition, which is similarly treatable. And man, we just did everything we could to help that patient recover. And she did. And she's still here today. So, okay. Now, I've just told you some stories. The model doesn't understand these stories. The model just trained these graphs. And by the way, the graphs really are the model. The millions of decision trees that were used to train these graphs, once we get the graphs, we throw the trees away. So you can print this model on a pad of paper. It'll be 56 graphs. And if you can go to every graph, come up with the score, add them together with 3 decimal digits of precision, you can now do exactly what the model does. The model really is these graphs, and that's going to turn out to be important. And there's lots of detail here, right? Everybody under 50 is kind of equal. 50, 60 is not too bad. Retirement has an interesting effect. The 85 effect, the 100+ effect, right? These are all really interesting details. And all of the graphs are interesting. We just don't have time to look at them. Here's something else that's interesting. It's the most accurate model ever trained on this data. So we got all of that intelligibility, all of that nuanced understanding of what the model is doing and what the data must look like. We got all of that without losing any accuracy. So this is a really good model. Now, there are other models that are comparable. Some of the black box models are comparable in accuracy, but they're all within epsilon of each other. There's no reason to pick one over the other. And if you can have intelligibility, you'd be crazy not to have it, to throw it away. Here's the other thing. How many of you believe a 105-year-old is actually intrinsically biologically lower risk than a 95-year-old? Doesn't make sense, right? You can believe the treatment story, which is we just don't give up on the patients who have made it over 100. You can believe that, but you don't biologically believe that people who are 105 are lower risk. Well, if you're going to use this model to decide what treatment to give to patients, whether to admit them in a hospital or something like that, you don't want to predict the 105-year-olds are lower risk than the 95-year-olds if it's not biologically, medically true. Well, the model is the graphs. We can edit the graph. If a clinician is confident, they can say, no, risk just monotonically goes up somehow, once you're elderly. And we want to get rid of this interesting effect where risk is going down above 100. We want you to get rid of that in the model, and we're just going to redraw this part of the graph. Now, we don't have any data to know exactly how to redraw that. If we had the data, we'd throw it in the training set, and the model might not have learned this in the first place. But we're going to do this, and we are confident that this model is more correct than allowing risk to go down above 100 if we're going to deploy this model and use it clinically. Now, do you always want to enforce this sort of monotonicity, even if you believe it's true? I don't know. If you're an insurance company, yeah, you just maybe want to know this is how the world works. The 100-plus-year-olds actually are a little better chance of surviving than the people in their 90s. So I need to keep more money in the bank for their healthcare in the future. But if you're a clinician who's going to use the model to make important medical decisions, you do want to edit the model. And that's going to be the crux of what we're going to talk about now for the second half of the talk. Model correctness and ultimately its accuracy in the real world depends on how the model will be used. An insurance company's use of the model is very different, hopefully, than a clinician's use of the model. So this model is fine for insurance companies, but it needs to be corrected for clinical use. Let me show you some things this model has learned just to drive home this point. First of all, there are jumps all over around numbers. You should be aware of those because there are very few phase changes in the real world. Those are almost always human social policy effects. I'll show you a bunch of those. The model has learned that having asthma is good for you. It lowers your chance of dying from pneumonia if you have a history of asthma. Hopefully that doesn't sound right, right? The model has learned that also having a history of heart disease is good for you if you now have pneumonia, okay? And the model has also learned that a kind of wheezing called stridor, which indicates you have blocked airways, so it's a sign of very advanced pneumonia, is good for you if you've got pneumonia. So like, how can advanced pneumonia be good for you if you've got pneumonia? Well, here's what the doctors do to explain this. So this is standard statistical confounding. So they basically say, well, you know, the asthmatics pay a lot of attention to the breathing. They have an inhaler. They try it. It's not designed to treat pneumonia, so it doesn't work. They've got me as a doctor treating them. They call the office, and I'm like, oh, the inhaler didn't work. Get in here right away. You show up, and hopefully I'm a good enough doctor to recognize you've got pneumonia. You got a history of asthma. I'm like, oh, you're serious. This is bad. So I give you very aggressive treatment for your pneumonia, and you got to healthcare faster because of your history of asthma. And although asthma is bad for you, if you've got pneumonia, there's nothing more valuable than rapid, high-quality healthcare if you have a treatable condition like pneumonia. And that's enough to flip the sign of asthma from being always bad for you to actually being good for you if you act on it. Same thing for heart disease. You maybe had a heart attack 2 years ago. You wake up this morning, your chest feels funny. If you're smart, you're thinking, I might be having a heart attack. You call an ambulance, you're in the ER in an hour, you get to the front of the line, they put probes on you. In 1 minute, they know you're not having a heart attack. And then hopefully later in the day, they realize, oh, you've got pneumonia, you have a history of heart disease, you're here in the ER, you get really high quality aggressive treatment, and you get it even faster than the asthmatics because you were smart enough to take an ambulance because you thought it might be something else. So that's how heart disease can be good for you if you've got pneumonia, even though it's probably not. Stridor, how can advanced pneumonia be good for you? Imagine two patients who are equally high risk, and one of them has more or less silent symptoms, and one of them has a symptom that no one can ignore. If one person in this room had stridor, we would all know it. It's that kind of wheezing. They could not suppress it, and it would be very loud. We would all know they had a problem, and we would tell them to immediately go to healthcare, and one of us would offer to drive them, okay? If you've got two people who are equal risk, and one has more or less silent, ignorable symptoms, and one has symptoms you cannot ignore, the person who has symptoms that will cause them to get health care faster and get more aggressive treatment is more likely to survive. And that's what's happening. Okay, now, clinicians are confident none of this is true. It's statistically true in the data, okay, because of the confounding with treatment. But they tell us we don't want the model to predict that, you know, the asthmatics are lower risk. So at a minimum, you got to flatten these curves to make that effect go away. Or, you know what, the asthmatics are higher risk, the heart disease patients, they're even higher risk. And man, the stridor patients have advanced pneumonia. They're the highest risk group at all here. So we want you to really increase the risk for these guys. So we can do that. It's an editable model, and we can do that. Something very interesting is going to happen here when we make these edits. The accuracy on the held aside test data is going to go down. And if you're an AutoML person, that's really upsetting to you. In the process of trying to make the model more correct to the doctors, we are going to throw some accuracy away. Now, why does the accuracy go down on the test data? It's a random sample from the training data. Whatever statistics are true in the training data tend to be true in the test data. So in the process of fixing these statistical confounding problems, we are going to hurt accuracy on the test set. So our accuracy is going to go down. And that's really annoying if you just spent you know, a weekend of CPU cycles to optimize your AutoML system to get the maximum accuracy on that held aside test set. That's what we're going to talk about. So now you could leave the model the way it is. Now remember, this is additive. So imagine we don't have anyone in the audience who's a 105-year-old asthmatic who had a heart attack 2 years ago and now has stridor. But if you were in the room, the model, uncorrected, would predict you are extremely low risk. Go on your skiing vacation in the Alps. You're fine. You know, if you're not feeling better in a couple of weeks, call us. That's an additive model predicting low risk because of these combination of effects that you've got. Now, the interesting thing is almost all black box models trained on the same data would do the same thing. This is not something unique to the glass box generalized additive model. It's just that we can see it. It's obvious in the glass box model. It's hidden in the black box model. So every data set everyone's ever trained on has these sorts of effects in it. And if you're using black box models, you just don't know that your models are doing some things like this. There's something that's even more annoying here, which is, remember, the accuracy will go down if we fix these things. That means if we don't fix them, the model is rewarded with extra high accuracy for predicting the wrong things. The more it predicts the wrong things, the higher the accuracy will appear to be. Now pause for a moment. This is like key moment in our thinking here. So this is really going to shake things up. It's going to be annoying as hell, but it's also going to create a lot of opportunities for us going forward, I think. The model's rewarded with illusory high accuracy for doing the wrong thing. And you're all guilty, as AutoML people, including me, of helping the models do this, okay? So you're helping the models maximally learn the wrong thing. Now, they're also learning a lot of the right thing, but they're also learning the wrong thing at the same time, right? Accuracy and correctness are not the same thing. And in AutoML, we almost always focus on accuracy. And what we probably should be focusing on, if we can figure out how to do it, is correctness. So let's talk about that. First of all, let me explain briefly why this is happening. So what's happening is AutoML, we almost always do it on retrospective data, right? We're doing retrospective analysis using a held-aside sample of our training data. And that's the source of the problem. If we were doing AutoML prospectively, that is, we actually had deployed the model in the real world and we were maximizing its accuracy in the real world, then there's a really good chance that accuracy and correctness are the same thing. They do imply each other. But when we do this on test data that's held aside, that's where we run into problems. So we're really just, been optimizing the wrong thing perhaps, and it wasn't so obvious until now. We've been optimizing retrospective test set accuracy. For people who work in causality, this is a well-known problem. Statistical confounding is one of the signs, but they understand that the model is not necessarily correct just because it's accurate. But I think the true magnitude of the problem was underappreciated until the rise of glass box learning in the last decade or so, because now we just see that it's everywhere. It just kicks you in the face every data set we use. In fact, I've never seen a complex data set that did not exhibit some of these problems. Hey, 90% of what's in the data sets is great and the models learn the right thing. But if 10% of what the models learn is the wrong thing, that's really important. Okay, so obviously what I'm suggesting is AutoML should optimize for correctness, not accuracy. That's not so easy. I don't know exactly how to do that. So I'll tell you some of our thoughts, but then it's up to the community. When I said I think there's a long runway for AutoML in the future, it's because of this sort of thing. I think it's going to be very exciting as we try to optimize for prospective accuracy, for correctness. Let me show you a few more of these models so you get an idea of the kinds of phenomena that we see, and then I'll show you what we're doing to try to address some of these issues. This is pneumonia risk as a function of your blood urea nitrogen. Below 30 is fine, above 30 is bad, the higher it is, the worse. Notice that risk kind of peaks a little bit at 50 and then goes flat for a while, and then it peaks right at 100 and then actually comes down. Notice that's 50 and 100. Like the units for blood urea nitrogen were not picked so that interesting things would happen at 50 and 100. Why is that happening? Well, at 50, they start giving you a medicine, and the medicine is effective, so it mitigates risk. And then if that's not sufficient, at 100, they start using dialysis. Dialysis is really effective, and that's how risk starts going down. If you're at 120 blood urea nitrogen, you're definitely getting dialysis. And it turns out, unfortunately or fortunately, your risk is actually less than a healthier person who's got a blood urea nitrogen of 90, but isn't getting dialysis. So that's how effective dialysis can be. So these are, what's known as treatment effects, and that's a very common problem in all of our data sets. And a cool thing about these kinds of models is we can do almost causal-like analysis. These are not causal models, but we can do causal-like analysis sometimes. And we can even estimate that if we were to change the dialysis treatment threshold to, say, 85 or something, we can even estimate that the risk curve would drop. And the difference between the original risk curve and the lower curve is lives saved. And that we would save maybe 2,500 lives or more in the US per year, maybe 50,000 lives per year, just by making this one change to a treatment decision threshold. So, and it turns out this is an old data set. Now healthcare has caught on, not because of this work, but they're smart people. And they now tend to give dialysis at lower blood urea nitrogen than 100 because they've learned that it is good. Treatment effects all over. This is your systolic blood pressure. Good blood pressure is like, 120, 130, 140. It is not the case that as your blood pressure goes up, your risk goes up. And then if it goes up even more, your risk comes down. And then if it continues to climb, your risk goes up again. And then if it goes even higher, it comes down again. These are treatment effects. And notice they're sitting at round numbers. Like this spike is happening at 200. This is happening at 225. This one looks like it's happening at 175. It's actually not happening at 175. It's happening at 180 because the definition that doctors use for hypertensive urgency is systolic blood pressure above 180. So that spike happens right there. So we see these sorts of things all over. If you are confident the patients will receive these treatments, you can leave the model the way it is because it is now accurately predicting risk for patients in the wild. However, if the model is going to be used to decide whether they should get treatment for their hypertension, then you have to modify this model so that it doesn't show that people who are 205 are lower risk than people who are 195. So you have to correct those sorts of things. Let me show you what an interaction is, then I'll show you a few other results from other data sets, and then we'll talk about the opportunities for AutoML and wrap up. This is an interaction. On the left, we have risk as a function of age. You've seen this graph before. The right, this is risk as a function of cancer. If you have pneumonia, having cancer does increase your chance of dying from the pneumonia. But there are some things you can't do as an additive function of just age plus cancer. You really need to do the exclusive or kind of combination of these things. So you need to do an interaction. This is an interaction between age and cancer for pneumonia, age on the vertical axis, cancer on the x-axis. And I want to draw your attention to this bright yellow at the bottom right here. These are patients who have cancer and are very young, and the model is adding a lot. 0.5 on a logit is a huge amount. The model is adding 0.5 to the risk. Now, I thought being young was good. Why are young cancer patients extra high risk? Well, young cancer patients, first of all, have different kinds of cancer than older patients. Moreover, we tend to treat their cancers more aggressively, partly because they can survive it and partly because they have different kinds of cancer. And that aggressive treatment tends to knock out their immune system. And if you have a patient who's got pneumonia and you've knocked out their immune system because of the treatment, you have now put them at extraordinarily high risk. So this is the opposite of the kind of treatment effects we saw in the previous graphs, where treatment lowered risk. In this case, treatment increases risk. Now, you still have to do it because, sadly, if they're not going to die from pneumonia, they're going to die from the cancer if you leave it untreated. So you have to do the treatment. But the treatment is putting them at extra high risk from pneumonia. So this is what a pairwise interaction looks like. And the model has learned this completely automatically. Okay. Let's just talk very quickly about a few others, and then we're going to wrap up. So ICU mortality, this is your chance of dying if you're in the critical care unit. This is PF ratio. It's a test of how much you're getting oxygen into your bloodstream when you breathe. Values near 0 are very bad. You're having trouble breathing. Values near 1,000 are great. You're very healthy and you're breathing. And what I want to do is draw your attention to this interesting spike that's happening in the graph. What is going on there? This is a region of very low risk sitting in a region of what is otherwise high risk. So what's going on? One clue is that this low risk at this spike is comparable to the lowest risk we see for the healthiest patients. So it turns out what's happening is there were missing values in the data. What they really do is they don't measure PF ratio on everybody. They pinch your finger. If pink comes back quickly, you're breathing fine. No reason to do the PF ratio test. 60% of patients don't get the test. So it's a missing value for them. And before we got the data, somebody imputed the missing value with the mean. And the mean of this feature turns out to be something right around here, like 323. So suddenly we have 60% of the healthiest patients sitting in a region on the graph where, by and large, we have unhealthy patients. We have patients who are at higher risk. And the model is doing everything it can to say, like, well, you know, people around 320 are high risk and people around 325 are high risk, but people at 323 are low risk. So it's doing its best to do that. So that's really interesting. And I assume, raise your hand if you are not thinking the following. Who's the idiot who imputed missing values with the mean? Like, okay. You're going to turn out to be right. So we're going to pay you afterwards. We have tried other imputation methods, random forest imputation, k-nearest neighbor imputation, lots of them. So we've tried all of these different methods. The blue curve is the risk curve you just saw in the previous graph. That's if you impute with the mean, and notice there's a little spike right there at the feature mean. This is what the model learns, the GAM learns, if you impute instead with random forest or with k-nearest neighbor. Notice it has lowered dramatically the risk in the entire region around the mean. So people in the 200 to 300 region who are very high risk are now going to get predicted as being lower risk, and people to the right of this will be predicted as lower risk. Why has this happened? Well, imputation was not smart enough to figure out that all these people should really be out near 1,000. And what it does is it put most of them still in the region, sort of 200 to 400. So it put a huge number of healthy people spread throughout this region of high risk. And that model then learned that it should learn lower risk for this entire region. So what the model did was it imputed all the values into this small neighborhood as opposed to putting them all out over here. That's a terrible thing. We are now going to predict that a lot of sick people are lower risk than they actually are because we screwed up the model by how we did fancy imputation of missing values. So it turns out it would be better to have just imputed with the mean and left the damage just sitting right here at 323 and still more or less have gotten things right for all the patients who are near 323, a little lower, a little higher. We'll actually injure fewer patients by doing the simpler imputation method. In fact, once we see this, in fact, what we end up doing is we end up treating the missing value as a unique value. We put it at, you know, -10 or plus 1,000, something like that. But that's not what you would think. It's not what your AutoML system would do. Your AutoML system, given the choice to try all these things, it sees 60% of the patients that it wants to get accuracy on, and it's going to screw up the model intentionally in order to get that accuracy. It's going to do everything it can. So surprisingly, AutoML will do the thing that is most dangerous for the sick patients. And it will do something that's not even as safe as it could do for the healthy patient. So it turns out AutoML will make the wrong decision here. Now, it turns out glass box learning has completely changed how we think about missing values, and that's because we can try them all, train the models, look at what happens, and like half the time we're like, oh God, that's terrible. I didn't know it was going to do that. We have to make sure it doesn't do that. Even though we were sort of educated to believe that that might have been the best way to impute missing values. Really, really interesting. So it's often going to pick the wrong method, and that's again because it's doing retrospective analysis on a test set as opposed to prospective analysis on the future world. Let me show you another data set, and then I'll have to start wrapping up. In fact, let me skip this data set. Here's a cancer clinical trial. Risk is a function of age. Risk goes up as the patients get older, and then weirdly it drops, like step function drop at 76. It turns out we talked to the clinician who's running this trial, and it turns out it's selection bias. You couldn't be in their clinical trial unless you were 75 or younger, or if you were over 75, you had to be extraordinarily healthy. And the doctor tells us, you know, our 80-year-olds on average actually are healthier than our 65-year-olds, and that's why the risk looks like it's less for them. Now, if you're only going to use this model for patients who are in the trial, then it's perfectly fine to leave it the way it is. But if you're going to use the model more broadly, we have to correct that either by flattening it or making the risk go up. One last example, because, you know, we're all probably still thinking about COVID as we fly to a meeting like this. This is, again, risk is a function of age, and we see jumps at all the usual places, 55, 65, but there's a jump at 85. What is extraordinary is this huge jump. That's a +1 logit. Okay, so that's a doubling of probability sort of happening at 95. So what's going on there with COVID? It turns out in the early days of COVID, there were do not intubate rules for patients 95 and over, and that's because intubation is a very aggressive, risky procedure, and they didn't use it. Now, if you're going to use this model to predict risk of patients where do not intubate is the rule, then the model is correct. However, if you're going to change this policy, which they quickly did once they started seeing how much extra risk the elderly patients were being put at by not intubating them, if you're going to do that, then you need to edit this. Okay. Every data set is flawed in unexpected ways. Retrospective analysis with AutoML exploits it and gives it illusory high accuracy. So what do? I think we just stop doing AutoML. Let's all go home. We don't even have to finish the rest of the conference. Obviously, I don't think that. So I think there are things that we can do. Well, maybe we can do AutoML for prospective analysis. That is, don't use a held-aside test set. Maybe once the model is deployed, that's when AutoML really kicks in and starts helping us improve that model on future real-world data. Maybe we need to focus more on AutoML for causal learning because some of these problems will go away. Maybe we can use AutoML to help us detect some of these problems. And then if AutoML can help us detect the problems, maybe then it can help us correct the problems because these glass box methods have ways for us to try to fix these problems. Let me briefly talk about some work we've done there, and then that's it. How do you detect these problems? I mean, what we do is we generate the graphs, we generate the model, we give it to doctors, we spend a lot of time looking at the graphs. Can we do something more automatic than that? Turns out LLMs can understand these models, can understand these graphs. There are ways to feed these graphs to the LLM so that they actually get it. And we can give them all the background information too. We can say this is pneumonia risk prediction. This is a feature that corresponds to the patient's age. We can tell it all that information. And they know quite a bit about pneumonia. They've read more pneumonia patients than any human has. And they actually do understand the model pretty deeply. They can summarize it. They can do queries. They can simplify the model. But perhaps the most important thing we could do is ask them, are there any surprises in the graph? Things that look weird, things that look wrong that should be fixed. And it turns out they can do that. So this is creatinine. Healthy creatinine is like 2 or less. So that's low risk here. Creatinine of 3 is quite high. 5 is very high. 10, wow, that's even worse. 10 is dangerously, very dangerously high creatinine. But notice it's one of the lowest risk regions of the graph. Why is that? It's a treatment effect. Okay, what's happening is in some places at 3.5 and in some places at 5, you start getting dialysis for your high creatinine, and dialysis is very effective, just like it was with blood urea nitrogen. We give this graph to the LLM and we say, this is pneumonia risk prediction. This is what the model has learned about log odds for creatinine. Do you see anything surprising? And it says, the graph shows surprising decrease in log odds of death from pneumonia as the creatinine increases beyond above 5, which is counterintuitive since high creatinine usually means worse outcomes. That's great. Here's for albumin. What's interesting here, I won't talk about the rest of the graph, but firstly it says it includes negative albumin levels, which is physiologically impossible and might represent some errors in the data. So that's really, really fun that it finds these sorts of things. Okay, so we did a study to compare LLMs to doctors, how good they are at finding these problems. The doctors thought there were 5 doctors in the study. Turns out there were only 4 doctors in the study and 1 LLM, and we're going to see how much they agree with each other. Correctness is hard to measure, but agreement is easy to measure. So just to summarize the results, it turns out that doctors are very good, specific at finding things that look surprising. The LLMs generate like a superset of what the doctors find. They generate about 50% more surprises, so they're not as specific. It turns out that doctors agree with each other a lot, even though they didn't talk to each other. And they agree a little bit less with the LLM, and the LLM agrees less with the doctors. And it turns out when you ask them to explain why something is surprising, once again, the doctors tend to agree with each other, but the LLMs tend not to agree as much. But the LLMs are already doing pretty well. And in fact, they're already good enough, and this is GPT-4. It turns out Claude looks like it's significantly better at this. They're already good enough to ask us a safety net, and it's disturbing, but the LLM GPT-4 found a problem in one of our graphs that we had all missed. And when the doctors saw it, they're like, oh yeah, that really is a problem. That really is something we should fix. So that's great. And I'm glad that they're less conservative and generating sort of a superset of the important things. Can we use LLMs to automatically correct the problems once we know there's problems there? Well, you've already seen that we can edit these models. We can make monotonicity, for higher risk in pneumonia. We can fix these sorts of things. We can edit these graphs. We've built a Photoshop-like tool for end users so that they can take these generalized additive models and they can edit the things that need to be corrected. And I just want to draw your attention. There are two doctors who are co-authors on this paper, Peter Stella and Mark Nunnally at NYU, helped us develop this system. And they now use the system when they train models at NYU. And this thing lets you do things like simple stuff like manual editing of the model to do those kinds of corrections, or you can do more sophisticated things. You can give it a noisy graph that should be monotone, and you can say use pair adjacent violators or use Platt's method to make this monotone increasing, and it will do it. Now, there are multiple methods for doing this. This is where AutoML can come in. So it's really a tool that has many, many different effectors. There are lots of different kinds of edits you might want to make. And this system, at the hands of an LLM might be a very powerful automatic tool for doing the kinds of edits that the previous LLM found when it was analyzing the graphs and finding problems. Okay, let's wrap up. Hey, every data set has these problems. If you think your data sets don't have the problems, it's only because you're not using interpretable machine learning. And even data sets that are not tabular have these sorts of problems. So even imaging text data sets have these problems. Sadly, we don't have as interpretable methods there. So we see this sort of thing everywhere. And you've got to keep in mind, accuracy is not correctness. That should be your new mantra, I think, for AutoML. And AutoML is usually optimizing accuracy retrospectively. So we need to do some sort of prospective AutoML for causal learning. Maybe AutoML can help us interpret these glass box models. Maybe can help us edit them. Maybe can figure out what edits to do that minimize the loss of accuracy while still achieving some sort of desired goal. Here's the take. If you want just one slide for the whole talk, this is it. Accuracy is not equal to correctness. And I think we're all really interested in optimizing models to be correct, not to be accurate on test set data. Interpret ML, there are lots of glass box methods out there now. This is just one of the open source packages. And let me just wrap up and say thanks.